on this episode of Indiana Education Insight.
What we say is it's the why and the how of how leadership is done versus what is done by the standards.
Every week, the Indiana Association of Public School Superintendents is taking you inside today's Indiana education collaboration and tomorrow's education trends. We're staying on the pulse of public school innovators throughout Indiana and beyond. Join our conversation and contribute to our upcoming topics at iapssin.org/podcast. Here's your host, Dr. J.T. Koopman.
Thanks for joining us on today's episode of Indiana Education Insight. I'm Dr. J.T. Koopman, Executive Director of the IAPSS. The podcast is being delivered by our IAPSS team and produced by our friends at Edge Media Studios. As Executive Director of IAPSS, I'm excited to bring you this weekly show where we feature Indiana education innovators from all over the state, from students to superintendents. We'll also be talking to higher education leaders and educators at the state level as we work together as proactive public education advocates. That's why IAPSS is here and why we're proud to bring you this show. Every week, we're talking about trending topics in the public education space while bringing in Indiana education innovators to hear their perspective. As with any organization, it takes great leadership to be successful, and that is one of the main missions of IAPSS, developing great school district leaders. It's always great to have experienced and passionate educators joining us on the show, so let's get started with the conversation today.
Topics and trends in Indiana education.
Today's guest is Dr. Todd Bess, Executive Director of the Indiana Association of School Principals. Dr. Bess has been a principal and assistant superintendent in Indiana schools, so having the ability to look at education from various lenses is very important. Dr. Bess is a tremendous asset to public education in Indiana. So let's find out how he views the changing landscape in Indiana public schools. We'd like to welcome Dr. Bess. We're absolutely thrilled to have you joining us on today's podcast. And as you know, the General Assembly just completed its work, but I think our audience would be interested in hearing a little bit about some of your background and how you got involved with the Principals Association and then your work in the General Assembly.
Well, thanks, JT. I really appreciate being here. As the School Principals Association, we try to work closely with our other associations, superintendents, school boards, school business officials, because it's really that collective effort that makes a difference with the General Assembly and with all of our members. JT, as you mentioned, principal, assistant superintendent, started my career teaching mathematics down in Center Grove, then moved up to the Lafayette area and lots of coaching in my background too, as I know you did as well. And then decided, hey, it's time to get into administration, and went that route over to Frankfort and so on. So joined the association now 7 years ago as the associate director, and I was fortunate to move up to be executive director 2 years later, and weathered down my 7th General Assembly. So hopefully we can keep on going as an association. But again, JT, thanks very much for having us here. It's always great to work with you.
Well, the experience that you bring to the Principals Association from your background, and also knowing that you have a family of educators in your midst, that's a great benefit to Indiana school principals. So thank you for your work in that arena. Let's talk a little bit about why it's different for today's principals and why it's important for today's school leaders to understand these changes.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think when I started in administration about in 95, we were just starting to see the transition from being a school manager to a school leader. And that really has just elevated, especially in the last few years, the pace of the schools, focus on teachers and teacher evaluations, school grades, student data, developing teacher leaders, I think is a real key now as well. And then just the volume of information hitting us all day long. We have an executive committee, just like you would have, And a person I think that's just a strong educational leader made a comment to our aspiring leaders the other day and just said, I was an assistant principal. I know she was in charge of a tremendous amount, but you can't imagine the pace of information and the volume of information that comes to you as a principal. So I think it really speaks to our leaders now figuring out how to manage the process versus just managing what they're tasked with each and every day.
I can't imagine the daily grind that principals go through today. So much more is being asked of them than it's ever been before. And so that manager's role is long gone by.
Yes.
And that leadership role and the expectations for principals is just a tremendous component of the ever-changing landscape for the principals. Parents, community members, central office people, students, teachers, support staff. It's just always ongoing and relentless.
Throw in a little social media just for fun, especially in the evenings when you're trying to maybe catch a little bit of downtime and all of a sudden a tweet or a post comes through and you've now rearranged your total agenda for the next 2 or 3 days just to help make sure kids are safe, students and staff's taken care of.
You bring up social media, and that's a key component of a changing role that we have. How can we help Indiana principals be more effective in leading their school districts?
Well, as I kind of mentioned, it's about managing information and process. We all hope to be an instructional leader in our buildings. But, as I was mainly in the secondary world, I would not have been able to handle all those subject areas and being that leader for each content area. So it's about developing those leaders, making sure that they are connected with you and corporation initiatives as well. I think that's one strategy. And that's, again, why I see a trend maybe going forward is how can we make all of our strong teacher leaders even more instructional leaders within the buildings. But one process that we've really tried to work on, JT, as an association, we've partnered with the Illinois Principals Association primarily, but then with 3 other states as well, to develop what we call a school leader paradigm. We know there are standards that our prep programs use for developing building leaders, and they absolutely need to adhere to those, and our building leaders need to follow those. But what we say is it's the why and the how of how leadership is done versus what is done by the standards. So that's going to be something that we really map out for our members, whether it's conferences or online professional development, or even as we advocate at the General Assembly.
Well, you were kind enough to share a little bit about that program with me, and
Sure.
and I just think that's an outstanding initiative that you have put together with some other states and other association executive directors, and that's going to be a model program for other states moving forward. So congratulations with that.
Well, thanks again. We're reaching out into our teacher prep and building prep programs. Not to say here's how you should do things at that college level, but please, as you're training new leaders and you realize that when they come into our world, this is where we're going to be going. So let's just collaborate. Let's build that great principle as soon as they enter the program.
Well, good. Well, there's a lot that we could talk about with the principal's role.
Yep.
But let's move on to the legislature for just a moment. The 2017 General Assembly just adjourned, and roads, infrastructure, and education dominated much of the conversation in this session. And we're here to talk about education. So in your opinion, what were the top 3 to 5 bills that affect public schools in Indiana?
Sure. And given that it was a long session, sometimes we say it's a very long session in those times. Let me give a great credit also. We have an associate director with IASP, Tim McRoberts, and he really did the bulk of committee work for us this year. And sometimes those sessions last until 6 or 7 o'clock in the evening, and then you're back in the basement perhaps of the State House for another House Education meeting at about 8 o'clock the next morning. So, Tim, thanks for that. Thanks for being a great leader for our principals. To your question, I think primarily the first one we have to talk about is House Bill 1003, student assessments. That was one of our top priorities, and really came down like I thought it would. The House introduced a version. We were probably pretty happy with that. Went over to the Senate. There were probably some pieces in there that we weren't as happy about. A conference committee occurred. They hammered out some other ideas. And in the end, behind some closed doors, came a final version of House Enrolled Act 1003. Puts a lot of power in the State Board of Education's hands. So those 8 people now, 10 people, once they name everybody else to there, they're going to have a lot to say about how things move forward. In that testing world, the elementary middle school, right now, they've not gotten the details that they really need. They're still going to be testing English language arts, math, some science, some social studies, but the content, the format, really all is going to come out of the RFP proposal running through the state board. So stay tuned for that, I guess. And then, in the high school world, we're going to go back to end-of-course assessments. That's also going to affect the graduation process now. So we'll wait to be determined on what that looks like, again, with the state board. Then there were kind of a collection of bills that I think that really dealt with content. 1007, course access. Senate Bill 29, which was the Indiana Studies course. And then Senate Bill 337, which was ethnic and racial studies. Really focused on what they want our kids to know at the high school level, and then the delivery in the online course content area too. Going to be pretty significant moving forward. 1009, you probably dealt with that one more than I did, because that dealt with how the funds are allocated and aligned.
Yep.
All those general fund and all the CPF funds are going to be gone. I think it's 3 now. Is that right? 3.
You have debt service, operations, and education.
There we go. So I think I see that as a positive move, perhaps, maybe better flexibility. Our small and rural schools especially struggle sometimes with how those funds are moved between, and this maybe give them flexibility. I'm also hoping that our legislature realizes that perhaps with this reset, that the 65% guideline that they keep hoping to see us achieve for money going into the classroom is maybe more of an arbitrary number. With this reset, let's see where we're at, and then let's determine what's really an accurate place to be. That's kind of my hope with 1009. 1005, Superintendent of Public Instruction will be appointed in 2025. That's a major change, and we didn't take a position on that.
Right.
We're going to work with whoever's in office.
Yep.
And so that's kind of how we approach that one. And let me comment too, JT, on some bills that didn't make it through or were changed that I think were significant too. There was 1384 that really would have changed how dropouts were calculated for high schools. That provision went away. 1130, student journalism, was a bill that was fast and furious, especially near the end, and ultimately was not passed.
Yep.
But we certainly are going to be supportive of that initiative. 1324 was school prayer. Senate Bill 29 was cursive writing, and Senate Bill 88 was school calendar. So all topics that got a lot of discussion again, but ultimately may not have made a huge impact. But we just need to pay attention to those going forward and see how that language plays out in the regs.
Going back to 1003, let's talk a little bit about does GQE, the graduation qualifying exam, stay in 1003?
Kind of, yes. And as I've joked, I talked about this provision up in our District 2 meeting up in New Prairie High School. It took me about 40 minutes, so I think we're going to take about 20 seconds here. But yeah, the GQE, where you had to pass the test in order to be eligible to graduate, that's been our lay of the land last several years. Now we're going to move to a graduation pathway, and the easiest way to meet that pathway is pass those end-of-course assessments. But if you don't, then the state board would determine other pathways that may make you eligible. SAT scores, ACT scores, IB, AP, dual credit, and probably the most significant change, especially for kids that have had trouble passing those tests, would be industry certifications, or perhaps meeting the career pathways that the DOE has set forth.
Right.
So again, state board's going to make a lot of decisions about this. Also, principals have had to use waivers at times for kids that just couldn't demonstrate the proficiency on that test, but we knew they had the skills.
Right.
That remains, yet a summer study committee is going to be formed that will look at how those waivers are administered. So I look for changes to come to that process, but glad that it still exists. That was one of those important things that we pushed for.
How about testing remaining as part of teacher evaluations and the school accountability grade?
Sure. And that was a small provision that made it in right at the end. A little bit of a surprise. Although it seems like the legislature has a little appetite now to take a look at student data and how it impacts the teacher evaluations. So that my understanding of that provision that goes in there now is corporations for 1 year, the 17-18 school year, can look at the percentage that goes into teacher evaluations. You can't take it out entirely. We know that significant has been that word and how to define significant has always been the question.
Yep.
Now it's just you have to use student data to inform evaluations. So again, a summer study committee. We'll take another look at that. I know we had some conversations with Senator Cruz and Senator Rotz about what that could look like going forward. And so we're hopeful, again, maybe a more realistic picture of what we should use after about 6 years of Senate Bill 1 so many years ago.
Well, I feel like that we made some progress on testing and doing the right things for the right reasons. We're not quite there, but we did make some progress. With the revision of No Child Left Behind and ESSA, we had the opportunity to do some things differently. So I hope that we can use some of that information from ESSA in our state to do some corrective action for some things that were pretty punitive in the past for Indiana schools.
I agree. We've got our state ESSA plan still to be submitted. Dr. McCormick's had their own approach to the listening tours, and I've participated in 4 or 5 of those, and those have really been good back and forth and gathering of information. And I know now there's about 4 or 5 work groups that are formed to help develop that state plan. So I'm hopeful that through the formation of that, coupled with what 1003 has told us, and even encourage a little bit from our state board and discussions that we had going forward near the end of the session, their question was, what does ESSA require? And that was kind of the bare bones approach.
Right.
And that's why I think in the elementary middle school world, you really just got language arts and math, science and social studies at the appropriate times. And now let the rule or let the RFP process guide us versus putting things into legislation. So again, we've made some progress. Let's keep going at that work.
Right. I agree with you. Well, you've been involved with education for quite some time and with the legislature now for 7 sessions. Have you recognized any trends that have evolved over the course of the last 7 years, especially with the legislature and education?
Well, I think the biggest trend that I've always been thankful for is that the Senate no longer meets in the room 233 in the State House. That was an awful room for Senate Education Committee meetings, and now they're in the Senate chamber. So you've got a comfy chair, and you can also plug in your computer and your cell phone to stay connected during those 5 or 6 hour committee meetings. So, you're probably thinking more educational trends.
Well, maybe.
Okay, well, we'll get to that then. Again, I think I referred to it a little bit that I think our legislators are feeling the effects of what that reform legislation was back in 2011. And that was my first year of being active with the association. And so supporting teachers, how that's going to happen, I think maybe some flexibility. We talked about the student data and how that informs our teacher evaluations. I'm hopeful that we can take another look at how schools are graded. Right now, that is at A to F in statute. We know that ESSA gives us flexibility. Dr. McCormick's talked about a scorecard more approach.
Dashboard.
And so, and that's something that I've heard in those ESSA meetings too is, let's talk about proficiency. Let's talk about growth. Let's talk about all the pieces that go into making up a school.
Mm-hmm.
In the high school accountability world, we've always felt pretty good about that, given that it's made up of 4 pieces. Well, now under ESSA, we're going to have about 4 pieces for each of those models, elementary, middle, and the high school. So now is the right time to maybe take that approach. We had a lot of reform under Governor Daniels, a lot of social issue focus under Governor Pence. And right now with Governor Holcomb, he seems to be focused on let's get things done. And so hopefully that's going to be some direction too in that General Assembly of how we look at things.
Okay. So, if you have the opportunity to kind of look into a crystal ball, where would you see education heading in the 21st century?
I think there's going to be a real focus on flexibility in how students attain their information, be it credit or otherwise, and their skills and credits. I think that may then lead to a new funding mechanism too. We've long heard that they want the money to follow the student. And so it's always been that per pupil basis. It would be extremely difficult to get to a per credit basis. But I see them taking a look at how that could look as well. I hope there's a renewed focus on supporting teachers, administrators, as those schools evolve. Because if we've got teachers teaching some blended courses, some online, some in the school building, that's a much different look. We know we have dual credit teachers that are going to be retiring soon, and we want kids to have dual credit. That saves parents a tremendous amount of money. We as a family have been a beneficiary for two of our kids going to college and having a lot of dual credit. So I think they're going to have to take another look at that. This was not the year to do so, but I'm hopeful that we come back to that next year in preparation for that next biennium. That's the right timing for that.
Well, of course, part of that is being dictated by higher education, and that's an arena that we don't have much control over.
Correct.
And it has been a tremendously beneficial program for so many Indiana families with dual credit and the ability to have basically a couple of semesters of college under their belt as they formally enter college. And so that's a lot of money. And so we certainly hope that doesn't go by the wayside as well. How they're allowing teachers to teach in the AP world and dual credit world is also up for conversation. And I hope that the universities will continue to extend those opportunities to high school teachers.
Yeah, they should. Again, we've been the tremendous beneficiary of that. And we have a son going to college this coming year. And as I put it to him the other day, your tuition costs in college are pretty well fixed. Wherever you're headed, they're going to charge you for all those credits, whether you get them now, over the summer, wherever. But if you're able to advance through some dual credit and AP worlds, that's going to help soften the blow for us.
Absolutely.
As a family.
Yep. Well, as superintendents and principals, what can we do to highlight all of the positive aspects of schools? And we know that great things happen every day in schools across the state. What approach should we take to deliver this message versus one of school grades and student test scores?
I think you've got to be the best PR agent in the world.
Absolutely.
That I joke about having a lot of soapbox comments, and that's one of my soapbox comments, is you've got to be that PR agent. You've got to be skilled at that. You've got to connect with your community. Principals work through your superintendent clearly, then through that school board, but keeping everybody informed about those great things beyond the grade card. And realistically, if we had testing situations the last couple of years that really impacted school grades, and we advocated to our principals, you need to tell your superintendent right now that A that you've had the last 3 or 4 years is going to be at least a C, and maybe not even a C. But here's why. Because your school board members are going to be your advocates. All your community members who know what is going on in your school, they're going to be the ones to cover things when times get hard, like we've seen the last couple of years in the testing world. So I think connecting all those groups with how kids are being served, bringing people in to be a part of those task force or stakeholder groups. I always used to say at Frankfurt when we would do back to school night, and yes, the same parents would be there, that were always there. And in your conversations with those parents, we're like, yeah, Tim and Johnny and Susie and Betty are great kids. And teachers would go, well, why do we have to do that, Todd? I said, because those are the ones that are going to support us. When it's a referendum time, when an issue arises in a community, we need to make sure that everybody's informed about the great things that are going on. So that's one way I see it. And whether the General Assembly favors a dashboard or not, local corporations, local principals can put that effort in front of people. So here's what's going on, and here's how we're measuring ourselves, and continue to be accountable even aside from the statewide accountability rules.
Well, that's another one of the major changes that I have seen evolve is that principals and superintendents are now into marketing their schools and marketing their programs and branding their name out there in the public. And so that's not something that we have been taught or instructed in our preparation courses, but something that's extremely important in today's education world. And we just haven't done a very good job of marketing our schools and tooting our own horns about the great things that we're doing in Indiana public schools.
You're right. We're so focused on our kids and serving them and serving our teachers that we don't often tell, here's the great things that we're doing. I make the plea about this time every year and going into the fall when we do our fall professionals conference to have the concurrent sessions. We need great breakouts, and those are put on by principals, assistant principals, teacher leaders, but they're often reluctant to say, I got a great program and here's what's going on, because they're just going about their own business. But it is time to be outward about those things. That's why in our school leader paradigm, we talk about being socially intelligent and how you're connecting with your community makes a big difference, allows you to meet all those building level standards in your work.
Yep. I agree with you. So let's talk a little bit about the teacher shortage. And I say
There is one.
The teacher shortage is looming, but in reality, it is ever present. And what are we going to do to attract students to enter education as a profession in the future? It appears that our recent years of focusing on test scores, school grades, and teacher evaluations is affecting students seeking to enter education as a career. How can we kind of stem that tide?
Yeah, that's a huge challenge for us. I've often said, because I work within the principal world, we've got a pretty good pipeline of principals coming in right now, and I'm glad for that. I see lots of good candidates that are going to be strong leaders for our schools, but we need a lot of teachers. We've got that generation retiring, and then when you don't have the millennials filling it, that creates that double-edged, shortage that I think we're seeing right now. Yeah. So we have to be champions. We have to say that education is the best profession to go into. And here's the realities. I'll put a plug in for one of our children, wants to be a high school band director. And he sat around our kitchen table and he's ridden with me to a lot of different events. And he understands the challenges. Here's going to be your expected salary range. Here's going to be the hours you go through. My wife teaches language arts, and he sees all the hours she puts in grading. But if it's a rewarding career, then this is where you should go.
Right.
We also have to think about our current high school sophomores. I think those are the generation, those are the kids that are going to be our teachers. And while that's 6 years away, we have to start promoting that in even greater ways beyond the cadet teaching that I would have known when I was principal at Frankfort. Finding ways to build that huge pipeline of there, attracting those great kids that are service-minded, want to be involved with kids at all the different levels, preschool to high school as well. We are the gatekeepers, JT, I say it that way. Principals, superintendents, school boards.
Right.
So we've had a lot of discussion in the last few years too about who is eligible to teach in our classrooms. And I certainly very much believe in our traditional approach of pedagogy that our higher ed institutions provide here in Indiana and across the nation. But I tell you right now too, in order to make sure we have qualified individuals in there, we have to think about alternate ways to get there. And again, then local boards, superintendents, and principals work together to say who's best to fit within our classroom. And again, developing a process. I think we have to think about that. And then we have to think about legislative action. Again, whether it's that dual credit world, which is kind of near and dear to our hearts of being in the secondary world. But who's to say that reading teacher in first grade isn't the more impactful teacher than that dual credit teacher is in the high school world. Right. So we have to think about ways that we're going to attract them as well. And that's going to take some dollars. And you go back to our General Assembly, we've heard the conversation many times that education is the biggest percentage of the statewide budget. Yet we also need to say, here's where that money's going. And with 1009, maybe that's our way to tell our story.
Well, and I think 1009, part of the ideology behind 1009 was to allow us that flexibility with boards and superintendents so that we can perhaps pay teachers more and put them more in line with where they need to be on a salary schedule. So, in closing, what advice would you have for current and future educators and educational leaders?
Well, first I say thanks to all of our current educators, principals, teachers, superintendents. We've weathered an awful lot of change in the last few years, and I think we're a better educational system for that in some ways. I might make a few changes if I were the Speaker of the House, but since I'm not, I'll just say thanks to everybody that's out there and has persevered and continued to be an educator. We're an education family: mother, sister, brother, wife, and sister-in-law, and so forth. So I guess I'll close with saying education is a great profession. As I told our aspiring administrators the other day at our conference, about 110 came to there. There's no better time to be an administrator, to make a difference for our kids and our teachers. It's tough. There's a lot of long hours, long days. There are no summers off, so to speak. But your reward for having served those kids is going to be tremendous. So please go into education. Please be an administrator. I'll even say please be a superintendent. How about that, JT?
Well, I appreciate that, and that certainly brings us to the end of this show. And I want to thank Dr. Todd Bess, the Executive Director for the Indiana Association of School Principals, for being our guest on IAPSS's edition of Indiana Education Insight. Up next, we're featuring a national education online trend that is relevant to our local Indiana institutions. This is a must-pay attention to moment, and that's right now.
A national trend that's impacting Indiana. It's time to bring in our featured panel for 5 on 5. 5 questions for our experts, 5 expert answers.
Joining us in studio is Aaron Sparks, President at Site Strategics. We talked last show about website accessibility, and we're going to go in a little bit of a different direction today and talk about the mobile websites. And so we appreciate Aaron joining us. So welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, JT. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well, thank you. What is the responsible design when it comes to mobile phones?
Well, what we're looking at here is designing a website to be able to adjust to different platforms, different ways that the user can experience your website. So desktop is one version,
right. Yeah.
And tablets are another, and obviously the smartphone is where a lot of consumers are regularly interacting with websites. So what we look at this is we term this responsive design, because actually we're responsive to the different windows or the apertures that people are looking at your website through.
Okay. Well, a lot of us just kind of take that for granted.
Yep.
What are the drawbacks about not having a responsive site?
Well, I'm sure that you've experienced it, and all of your listeners have. Whenever you go to a website on your smartphone, and then you do that pinch and zoom, right? Because the site's not coming up, it's very, very tiny to see, and as soon as you get there, right, you're a bit frustrated and kind of irritated that you have to zoom in and try to finagle a click on a link. There's so many frustrations that can turn into loss of consumers, loss of interaction on a website, and more people are using their smartphones for that first initial area of interaction with the website. In fact, in 2015, searches on Google actually have bypassed, the mobile searches have bypassed the desktop search. That means that more people are searching on mobile and interacting with websites at the mobile platform first.
Okay. Well, actually, I had that experience before I came on to record today's show.
Yep.
When I was waiting out, and the website that I went to, and I was on my iPhone, did exactly what you're referring to. It was not responsive at all in relationship to that particular device.
And we're seeing that more and more. Forgive me. we're seeing that frustration and that experience happening more and more. And so there's a lot of sites that got designed 10 years ago,
Right.
or even 5 years ago, that didn't have that type of programming to be able to be responsive to different platforms. So it's a common thing.
Well, it makes a lot of sense with the number of devices and the types of devices that people have today
Yep.
and how they're accessing that information. I've heard you talk about traffic analytics from websites during the time we've known each other. What does the phrase bounce rate mean, and how does it apply to mobile websites?
Right. So bounce rate is really kind of the first level of understanding that we can see from a consumer. Either they're coming from a desktop or a tablet or a smartphone, but it's that first that tracking of whether or not, well, as we interpret it, how they're looking at the content and seeing if they're finding what they're looking for. If a user session comes to the website, then leaves immediately and does not go further into any page, any click on a website and a deeper page, or looking at PDFs or what have you. If they're jetting off as soon as they get there, right? That's called a bounce rate. So it's the number of impressions and how often the users will actually leave the website. So if you have a really, really high bounce rate, meaning you can interpret it that there's so many people that are not finding what they're looking for. It's not, and if they have to pinch and zoom, right, they'll just leave and find another website that is responsive. And that increases the bounce rate of the website. But we can actually track it on the different types of devices that are coming to your website as well.
Okay. Well, I've often wondered because when I look at websites and I don't find them either easy to use or appealing, and I go off, in the back of my mind, I'm wondering if somebody is watching that type of movement and that type of traffic, and apparently they are.
Absolutely, or they're not. That's the other thing, is that if you're not paying attention to your analytics, then you don't know that consumer engagement. You don't know what you don't know. So having a web firm, a marketing firm that actually can understand and report to you those rates, right, and also give you strategies on how to improve. The lower the bounce rate, the more engaging your content and your product is.
And of course, that's the whole point,
right?
Is to engage users. Are there any issues with having a separate mobile site for mobile users?
Now, that's a good question. We've seen it before where, and that's really where you saw maybe 10 years ago, 8 years ago, where the solution was not to fix somebody's website, but actually offer up an alternative, and a little bit of code in the page would redirect somebody to their mobile experience. That was satisfactory for a while. However, Google didn't want to have duplicate content out there on the mobile site and the desktop. They wanted you to send and provide the experience of your content to the traffic that they're sending, and not having to shift everything around. So about 4 to 3 years ago, they really put a kibosh on using mobile sites, because it did create duplicate content, which they're trying to avoid. So it is not best practices at all to have a secondary site that is just mobilely responsive. That's a bit of a challenge, because there's a lot of investment that has been made on these mobile sites that are out there, right? But they're really not mobile. They're just kind of trimmed down. They're not really responding to user activity. They're just a smart screen, fixed width type of font and fixed width dimension, and it's not what Google's wanting you to execute on. And that's really kind of the long game, is making sure that Google sends traffic to you that it sees, it's interacting with you, and its users enjoy your content. If your site's not responding, those are signals that the consumer is going to push away.
Sure.
And ultimately you will get deranked. I shouldn't say deranked, but you'll lose positioning on search engines, because there's going to be other content that's more attractive to the consumers.
Well, all of this is very interesting, and it makes a lot of sense to me. Duplication seems to be expensive, whereas if you develop it for all devices at the same time, it seems to be that would be more responsive and achieve your end game more quickly.
Absolutely.
So how do we know if our site is mobile friendly, and what if it isn't? And then basically, how do you rate or rank the IAPSS website?
Well, one, you can immediately test it with your smartphone, right? But there's actually a Google mobile friendly test that you can just search on Google for Google mobile friendly test, and it brings you up a testing tool that you can actually drop your domain name in there, and it will immediately render out the page and be able to give you kind of a score on how friendly you are to a mobile audience, right? For your last bit there, IAPSS was built to be mobily responsive, right? Interesting enough here is, and we did that obviously with the tactic of getting your content to the superintendents in their smartphone whenever they can actually look up content and look up news and videos and what have you. But interesting enough here is the analytics that we are tracking, right? Now we talked about bounce rates, right? You actually have a higher bounce rate on the mobile traffic than the desktop traffic. You're about 38% bounce rate, which is fantastic from a bounce rate. That means that 60-70% of your audience on desktop is finding exactly what they're looking for. The mobile traffic's a little bit higher, and this is what I was talking about before. You can try to deduce that maybe they're not getting what they're looking for.
Right.
In this space, they are getting what they're looking for. I'd posit the thought that they're finding exactly what they're looking for. They don't have to spend as much time. You're still in the mid 40s on bounce rate, a little bit higher than desktop. But the mobile traffic that are going to IAPSS, they're finding what they're looking for. They're not spending as much time because they can see it immediately and be able to get to what they're looking for immediately. So that's a bit of a reversal, but you've got a lot of mobile traffic, a lot of people finding what they're looking for right away.
Well, I would be remiss if I didn't tell our audience that our website was designed by Site Strategics, and it's to their credit and their expertise that we have that ability with the folks that are using and accessing our website. So I want to make sure that I thank Site Strategics and your team for their work on our website.
Certainly, you're more than welcome, and we appreciate the relationship.
Absolutely. Well, we'd like to thank our guest, Aaron Sparks, President and CEO of Site Strategics, for being on today and talking to us about the topic of a responsive device and all of the work that he has done. Now it's time to wrap up this episode with my take on the current state of affairs in Indiana education landscape.
Dr. JT's closing comments.
Unfortunately, even though we've had testing debacle in Indiana public schools, and with the new federal education guidelines called ESSA that will allow states to change past practices of what we've done in education for the last 15 years, we had a bill, House Bill 1003, that our last guest talked about, that replaced the Indiana test called ISTEP with ISTEP, but it will be called iLearn. We had a chance to get it right, but we missed a golden opportunity, in my opinion. Perhaps we can pursue this issue and others in another segment. On our next show, we welcome the newly elected state superintendent, Dr. Jennifer McCormick, and we will ask Dr. McCormick to provide some additional insight into the State House and education in her first General Assembly as the state superintendent. Join us for that and more on the next Insight into Indiana Education. Thanks for being part of education, and thank you for standing up for public education in the state of Indiana.